Hello viewers. Man-made climate change and how politics couldn't resist. Politicians are building a price-driving energy policy on the idea of man-made climate change. Yet the greenhouse theses have long since been disproved. All parties in the industrialized countries, right or left, will adopt the CO2 global warming theory. This is a unique chance to tax the air we breathe. Because they are supposedly saving the world from heat death, the politicians will be applauded for doing so. No party will resist this temptation. This is what Nigel Calder, the award-winning British science journalist, longtime editor of New Scientist and BBC writer, predicted to me back in 1998. Together with the Danish physicists Hendrik Svensmark and Egil Friis Christensen of the renowned Niels Bohr Institute, he published the book, The Manic Sun in 1997, in which they make the sun responsible for our climate on the basis of research. Climate change. The big CO2 lie. He was right in his assessment of the parties. But the results of the researchers, which include scientific work on the effects of the sun and radiation from space on our climate, are largely hushed up. Politicians can't do anything with that. This would mean that the flood of laws with which citizens are forced to pay ever new levies and taxes in order to save the world could no longer be justified. Neither light bulb bans nor the gigantic subsidies for so-called renewable energy would make any sense. Instead of using taxes to influence climate change, they would have to deal with the consequences of natural climate change. There is no debate about the causes of climate change. There is no debate about the causes of climate change in political Germany. It is simply stated. The emission of greenhouse gases leads to global warming. That is largely undisputed, says Ottmar Edenhofer, the chief economist and vice director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. His colleague Stefan Romstorff has simply declared the debate over the causes of climate change over. The Green Party, which has elevated man-made climate hybris to a party platform, expressed outrage in a question to the federal government about whether it knew that climate deniers were allowed to speak in the chambers of the Bundestag. At the invitation of FDP Member of Parliament Paul Friedhof, the founder of NASA meteorology and multiple award-winning American scientist Fred Singer spoke about his research findings. Already who independently argues with the climate dictate is accused of heresy. 800 scientific publications against a CO2 thesis for a week. Representatives from nearly 200 countries have been discussing the concrete implementation of the Paris Climate Agreement. Reinforcement has now come from Hollywood. Arnold Schwarzenegger, California's ex-governor, warns of a climate collapse. Source: N24 Laura Fritsch. But what comes across as unshakable truth in a strictly scientific way can be unmasked as clever, even ingenious propaganda, if you do not only inform yourself one-sidedly. There are about 800 scientific publications from the last years which refute the CO2 greenhouse hypotheses. The main difference to the climate modelers: they present experiments with measurements, while the studies published by the IPCC, the international authority that likes to be called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, are based on computer models and calculations. In a nutshell, the opposition is facts versus calculations. But if the facts are not perceived by the public, they have no influence in political decision-making. The claims of climate modelers should be taken with a grain of salt in this context. The climate modelers' repeated claims should already make one suspicious. The scientific debate on man-made climate change is over. This is unsurpassable in hubris and arrogance and contradicts any definition of science. As evidence for the definitive greenhouse gas theory, it is repeatedly put forward that 97% of scientists agree. To be read in Der Spiegel, repeated on ZDF in Frontal 21, and by Guido Knopp's History. 97%. All journalistic warning signals should light up. For example, 97% of how many scientists? And which scientists do they include? Who selected them? Twice in the last 2 years, critical scientists from all over the world have met in Berlin to present their new research, which comes to different conclusions than the IPCC makers and their believers. But then the Potsdam Institute is conspicuous by its absence. Hardly any member of the Bundestag and hardly any journalist take the trouble to inform themselves. Al Gore unveils new climate documentary 11 years after An Inconvenient Truth. Now comes the sequel. Starring alongside Al Gore, President Donald Trump and his decision to withdraw from the Paris Global Climate Agreement. Source: N24 Isabel Bouillon. Another ploy to stifle debate is the claim that the impact of CO2 on climate has been known for 150 years. This is a reference to Swedish chemist and all-around scientist Svante Arrhenius, who hypothesized, without evidence, that CO2 would warm the climate, though he thought this would be a great boon to humanity. Except for extrapolations, the CO2 climate warmers have nothing tangible to offer to this day. The basic figures for the IPCC's calculations have been destroyed at the lead British Institute at Norwich University. For his world-shaking examples in his film An Inconvenient Truth, the Office, Al Gore has apologized. The figures and data had been taken over unchecked from the Munich Reinsurance Company, wrote Roger Pielke Jr. in the New York Times of February 23, 2009. By the way, the film was forbidden by the High Court in England and Wales for school lessons because of its many mistakes if it is shown without corrections. In Germany, it is still part of the curriculum. CO2 pricing has nothing to do with environmental protection. Climate targets put Germany's prosperity at risk. Germany misses its climate targets by miles. From an economic point of view, it is impossible to implement the promises made by the government by 2030. This is the result of a calculation for the Ministry of Economics. Nevertheless, the German government and its opposition are building a price-driving energy policy on the model of man-made climate change, which is costing the German economy hundreds of billions of euros. The fact that it is increasingly alone in the world does not bother it. At the last G8 summit in Deauville, almost unnoticed by the German public, Canada, Japan, Russia and France gave assurances that they would no longer participate in any conferences on a successor to the Kyoto Protocol. The USA only wants to send observers. While the Chancellor's advisors on climate issues from the Potsdam Institute are still tinkering with scenarios on how CO2 can be fairly distributed in the future by a global authority, which of course will help determine the economic competitiveness of each country, the rest of the world is slowly saying goodbye to this new Babylonian tower construction that would have marginalized the Central Planning Authority of the USSR. In the USA, the CO2 exchange has burst. In Asia it was not even introduced. In Australia governments are falling over it only in Europe, and under the leadership of Germany is CO2 supposed to have a price. It is a real air act. The only tragedy is that even if no one joins in, the German parties are still determined to push through the pricing of CO2 as a model for the whole world. This has nothing to do with energy transition or environmental protection. The Germans and the fear of the end of the world. Nigel Calder also had a rationale for this back in 1998. In the beginning, the CO2 and global warming theory was an Anglo-Saxon invention, promoted not least by the nuclear industry, which hoped for a revival. But then it became more and more a scenario for the end of the world, and that was repugnant to the sober Anglo-Saxons. Then one remembered in the IPCC. The Germans are best for doomsday theories. When it comes to the end of the world, the Germans are best. So the climate greenhouse doomsday theory was handed over to the Germans. I'm afraid Nigel Calder is right again here. If you liked the video, please hit the like button on this page and subscribe if you would like to hear more. The more likes and subscribers, the more videos.